Hello, Midnight Wanderers, and welcome to Dreadvein. This is where ancient whispers rise beneath a crimson sky, carrying you softly into the world of dreams and shadows. Before tonight's haunting story begins, tell me, what corner of the world are you listening from? Drop it in the comments. And if the silence of the night calls to you, don't forget to like, subscribe, and ring the bell, so you'll never miss the moon's next dark secret. One of the strangest memories I have comes from when I was around 5 or 6 years old. I'm 32 now, and despite the amount of time that has passed, I can still picture the events clearly. Over the years, I've tried to explain it away, convince myself I remembered things incorrectly, or find some logical explanation that would make sense of it all. But every time I revisit the memory, I end up in the same place. I simply don't know what happened. At the time, my mother was seriously ill and had been admitted to the local hospital for several days. As a young child, I didn't fully understand what was wrong. I just knew that my mother wasn't home and that everyone around me seemed worried. Hospitals felt strange to me back then. The smell, the bright lights, the long hallways, the waiting rooms filled with people sitting quietly. Everything about the place felt unfamiliar and unsettling. On the first day we visited her, my father, grandmother, and I were driven to the hospital by my uncle. I remember the drive vaguely, but I remember the waiting area much more clearly. We arrived before visiting hours officially began. Since we had some time to wait, my father left to get food for everyone, while my grandmother, who I always called Nana, stayed behind with me. We found seats in the waiting area and settled in. Like most 5-year-olds, I quickly became bored. There wasn't much for a child to do in a hospital waiting room. No toys, no television that interested me, nothing exciting. That's when I noticed the old man. He was sitting nearby in a wheelchair. What stood out immediately was that he also had crutches. Even as a child, I thought it looked unusual because he seemed to depend heavily on both. He was elderly, thin, and looked tired, but there was something warm about him. He smiled easily. He spoke kindly, and unlike most adults in waiting rooms, he actually seemed interested in talking. My Nana started chatting with him. At least, that's how I remember it. The conversation seemed completely natural. The old man explained that he was there to visit his wife. She was very sick. Even at that age, I understood enough to recognize the sadness in his voice whenever he mentioned her. Still, he remained cheerful. He joked with me, asked me questions, told little stories. The waiting room suddenly felt less boring because of him. I remember liking him almost immediately. There was nothing frightening or strange about the encounter. Just a kind old man passing time while waiting to see his wife. Eventually, my father returned with food. Visiting hours began, and we went upstairs to see my mother. The visit itself faded from memory over the years. The old man did not. The next day, we returned to the hospital. Everything seemed familiar. Same building, same waiting room, same routine. My father once again went off to get food while Nana sat with me. And that's when things became strange. The old man was there, sitting in almost the same place, looking almost exactly the same. At first, I was happy to see him. After all, he had been friendly the previous day. But something immediately felt different. He wasn't talking. He wasn't smiling. Instead, he was staring directly at me. Not in a threatening way, more in a concerned way. As though he desperately wanted to tell me something. I remember looking back at him and trying to start a conversation. Like any young child, I asked a completely random question. Something about whether he had a Sega Mega Drive. At the time, that was probably one of the most important topics imaginable to me. What happened next is one of the reasons the memory never left me. The old man appeared to respond. I remember him speaking. I remember him reacting. But Nana completely ignored him. Not just ignored his answer, ignored his existence. At first, I didn't think much of it. Adults ignore things children find important all the time. But then something else happened. The man slowly got out of his wheelchair. It looked difficult. He leaned heavily on his crutches and stood there. Then, he made what seemed like a perfectly normal conversational comment to my Nana. I don't remember the exact words anymore, only that he was clearly speaking to her, and she acted as though he wasn't there. No acknowledgement, no response. Nothing instead. She continued talking to me about completely unrelated things, as though there wasn't a man standing right beside us. I remember feeling confused. The old man looked confused too, almost hurt, almost upset, as if he couldn't understand why he was being ignored. The longer it continued, the stranger it became. My Nana spoke normally to everyone else. She chatted with my father when he returned. She spoke to members of staff. She interacted with other visitors. Yet she never once acknowledged the old man. Not a glance. Not a word. Nothing. Eventually, it was time to visit my mother again. We stood up and started walking away. The old man remained where he was, still watching, still looking concerned. I remember repeatedly looking back over my shoulder, again and again. Each time I looked, he was staring directly at me. There was something deeply unsettling about his expression. Not frightening, worried, as if he wanted me to understand something that I couldn't, as if he was trying to communicate something important. Then eventually, he disappeared from view as we turned the corner and headed toward my mother's room. The following day, he wasn't there. Neither the day after that, nor any other time we visited the hospital. I never saw him again. As a child, I eventually stopped thinking about it. Life moved on. School happened. Teenage years arrived. The memory drifted into the background. Yet it never completely disappeared. Every so often, it would resurface. Usually when something reminded me of hospitals or childhood memories. As I got older, I occasionally asked my Nana about the man. Every time, she seemed confused. She insisted she couldn't remember him. At first, I assumed she had simply forgotten. Years had passed, after all. Then came a conversation I'll never forget. By the time I was around 19, my Nana's dementia had become severe. Conversations could be difficult. Sometimes she struggled to remember recent events. Sometimes she struggled to remember people. I often tried bringing up old memories because familiar topics sometimes helped stimulate her mind. One day I mentioned the old man from the hospital. I wasn't expecting much. I certainly wasn't expecting what happened next. The moment I brought him up, her expression changed. For a brief moment, she seemed unusually clear. Then, she said something that sent a chill through me. Mr. Wilson was always so pleasant. I remember freezing, because it was the first time she had ever acknowledged him. Then, she added another sentence. He died the same day as his wife. She wasn't well. That was it. She spoke as though it were common knowledge, as though she were discussing an old neighbor. Then the clarity faded, and the conversation drifted elsewhere. But those words stayed with me. For years, I couldn't stop thinking about them. Who was Mr. Wilson? Why had she suddenly remembered him after years of denying any memory? And what exactly had happened at that hospital? Eventually, I brought the story up with my father. I told him everything. The waiting room, the old man, the conversation, what Nana had said before she died. To my surprise, my father immediately recognized the name. Mr. Wilson had been real. Not only real, but someone my Nana had known personally. According to my father, Mr. Wilson had lived just a few doors down from her for years. They had been neighbors. He was familiar to the family. Then came the detail that truly unsettled me. Mr. Wilson had died during the first night we were at the hospital while waiting to visit his wife. His wife died as well. The timing matched exactly. And according to family recollections, both deaths occurred before the second day. The day I distinctly remember seeing him sitting in the waiting room while nobody else appeared capable of noticing him. For a long time, I tried to convince myself there was a simple explanation. Maybe I had seen him the first day and somehow imagined the second. Maybe memories became mixed together over time. Maybe childhood perception had distorted the sequence of events. Those explanations are certainly possible. Memory is imperfect, especially memories from early childhood. But no explanation has ever completely satisfied me. Because I remember that second day vividly. I remember speaking directly to him. I remember him standing. I remember Nana ignoring him. And most of all, I remember the expression on his face as he watched me leave. A look of concern, a look of sadness, a look that seemed to say he knew something I didn't. Was it a ghost? A misunderstanding? A childhood memory shaped by decades of reflection? I honestly don't know. All I know is that when I was a small child sitting in a hospital waiting room, I spent an afternoon talking to a kind old man named Mr. Wilson. And years later, I learned that according to everyone else, he had already died. During college, I worked at a small retail store inside a shopping mall. It wasn't a particularly exciting job, but it paid the bills and fit around my class schedule. Most shifts were uneventful. You helped customers, stocked shelves, cleaned up, and eventually locked the doors at the end of the night. For the most part, it was exactly what you'd expect from a mall retail job. But one night changed the way I felt about closing alone forever. The store wasn't huge. It had a sales floor in the front and a stockroom in the back. The stockroom was where we kept extra inventory, supplies, and personal belongings during shifts. There was also a small break area back there, nothing fancy. Just a folding card table and 4 chairs where employees could sit during lunch breaks. The setup was always the same. The table sat against one side of the room, and the chairs were positioned around it. Simple, ordinary, completely forgettable. One evening, I was scheduled to close the store by myself. That wasn't unusual. Mall traffic had slowed down, and management often left one employee to handle the final hour before closing. By the time the mall officially shut down, most of the surrounding stores had already gone quiet. The crowds disappeared. The atmosphere changed. Anyone who has worked in a mall after hours knows the feeling. A place designed for thousands of people suddenly becomes eerily empty. The bright lights remain on. The music still plays, but the energy vanishes. Everything feels strangely hollow. That night seemed normal at first. I locked the entrance gates and started working through the closing routine. Count the register, organize displays, return misplaced merchandise, clean up anything that needed attention. The usual stuff. At one point, I carried several items into the stockroom. I remember walking past the break table. The chairs were exactly where they always were, around the table. Nothing unusual. I dropped off what I was carrying and headed back to the front of the store. For the next 10 minutes or so, I continued closing. I was completely alone. I knew that because I had locked the store. No customers, no coworkers, nobody. The only sounds were the distant hum of the mall and the occasional noise from maintenance crews somewhere far away. Eventually, I finished everything I needed to do. The only thing left was grabbing my coat from the stockroom and heading home. I remember feeling relieved. It had been a long day. I was tired. My mind was already focused on getting out of there. I walked toward the back room, opened the door, and immediately stopped. For a second, my brain refused to process what I was looking at. The room was wrong. Not dramatically wrong. Not broken. Not destroyed. Just wrong. The 4 chairs that had been around the table were no longer around the table. They were lined up, perfectly lined up, side by side, facing directly toward the doorway where I was standing, facing me. I froze. The chairs weren't close to the table either. They had been moved several feet away, far enough that it was impossible to dismiss as a chair accidentally sliding or being slightly out of place. Someone, or something, had repositioned every single one. The arrangement was strangely deliberate. That was the part that got me. If I had walked in and found one chair tipped over, I probably would have assumed it got bumped earlier. If 2 chairs had shifted, maybe I would have blamed my memory. But all 4, perfectly aligned, facing the door? The setup looked intentional, almost as though someone had arranged them specifically to greet whoever entered the room, which, unfortunately, was me. I stood there staring, trying to come up with a logical explanation. Maybe I had somehow forgotten moving them. Except I knew I hadn't. I remembered walking past that table only minutes earlier. The chairs had been where they belonged, around the table. Normal, nothing unusual. Now they weren't. The silence in the room suddenly felt overwhelming. Every hair on my arm stood up. I remember looking around the stockroom, expecting to find someone hiding. A coworker playing a prank. A maintenance worker messing with me. Anybody, but there was nobody. The room was empty. The shelves were still. Nothing moved. Nothing made a sound. And somehow that made it worse. Because if there had been a person, at least there would have been an explanation. Instead, there was only a row of chairs staring back at me. The longer I looked at them, the less comfortable I felt. It wasn't just the fact that they had moved. It was how they had moved. 4 chairs don't quietly relocate themselves across a stockroom. Even if someone had done it as a joke, it would have made noise. The floor wasn't carpeted. Dragging 1 chair would create sound. Dragging 4 chairs would create a lot of sound. Yet during the 10 minutes I spent at the front of the store, I hadn't heard a thing. Not one scrape. Not one bump. Nothing. At that point, every survival instinct I possessed took over. I stopped caring about explanations. I stopped caring about coats. I stopped caring about being rational. I wanted out. Immediately, I grabbed my coat as fast as I could and left the stockroom. Then I left the store. Then I called mall security. Trying to explain the situation felt ridiculous even while I was doing it. What exactly was I supposed to say? Hello, I think my chairs are haunted. Still, I knew something wasn't right. Security took the report seriously enough to investigate. Several officers arrived and searched the store. They checked the stockroom, the sales floor, storage areas, anywhere a person could potentially hide. Nothing, nobody, the entire store was empty, exactly as I had expected. When I showed them the chairs, they looked unimpressed. One of them eventually suggested the explanation I already knew was coming. You probably moved them and forgot. I remember almost laughing. Not because it was funny, because it was frustrating. From their perspective, it was the most logical explanation. People forget things. People get tired. People misremember details. That explanation made perfect sense. Except I knew what I had seen. I knew where those chairs had been. I knew they weren't lined up when I walked out of that room, and I knew I hadn't spent 10 minutes arranging furniture and then somehow erased the memory from my brain. Security eventually finished their search. No intruders. No evidence of anyone entering the store. No explanation. Just 4 chairs lined up in a way that made absolutely no sense. The official conclusion was that nothing unusual had happened. The unofficial conclusion was that I wanted absolutely nothing to do with that stockroom anymore. I finished the paperwork, locked up, went home, and spent far more time thinking about chairs than any normal person should. What bothered me most wasn't fear. It was the lack of an explanation. Most strange events can eventually be traced back to something ordinary. Human error, miscommunication, a forgotten detail. This one never really got there. Even now, years later, I can still picture the exact scene. The stockroom door opening, the fluorescent lights humming overhead, and those 4 chairs sitting in a perfectly straight line as if they had been waiting for me to return. Maybe there is a completely rational explanation. Maybe exhaustion played tricks on my memory. Maybe someone moved them and escaped detection. Maybe. But I know one thing for certain. I never closed that store alone again. And if I had opened that stockroom door one more time and found those chairs moved again, I probably would have quit on the spot. Some mysteries are interesting. Others are just deeply unsettling. For me, 4 silent chairs in an empty stockroom fall firmly into the second category. Of all the things I expected to see while serving in the Navy, finding myself face to face with a dead man in the middle of the Indian Ocean was not one of them. It remains one of the most surreal and disturbing experiences of my life. Not because there was anything supernatural about it, but because it forced me to confront something that most people rarely think about. How vast the ocean is, and how quickly life can disappear within it. At the time we were sailing through the Indian Ocean, it was one of those rare days where everything seemed perfect. I was off duty. The weather was beautiful. The sea was calm. The sun was shining. For once, there was absolutely nothing I needed to do. Anyone who has served at sea knows how valuable those moments can be. Life aboard a ship is structured around schedules, responsibilities, drills, and routines. Free time feels precious because there never seems to be enough of it. I had found a quiet spot on the quarterdeck. It was one of my favorite places to sit when I wanted to be alone with my thoughts. I sat on the edge with my legs dangling over the side of the ship. The deck was high enough above the water that there was no danger of my feet touching the sea, but if the ship was moving fast enough, the spray would occasionally rise and catch them. It was peaceful. The kind of peace that only exists when you're surrounded by nothing but ocean in every direction. No traffic. No cities. No noise except the ship and the sea. I had headphones on and was listening to Bob Marley. To this day, hearing some of those songs instantly takes me back to that afternoon. The music was playing, the sun was warm, and for a little while, all felt right with the world. I remember looking out across the horizon. Nothing but blue, sky above, ocean below. The sort of view that makes you feel incredibly small. After a while, I glanced down toward the water alongside the ship. And that's when everything changed. At first, my brain didn't understand what it was seeing. There was a face, looking up at me. For a fraction of a second, I genuinely thought my eyes were playing tricks on me. The image seemed impossible. A face shouldn't have been there. Not hundreds of miles from land, not in the middle of the ocean. Yet there it was, floating in the water, staring upward. The body drifted alongside the ship for only a moment before beginning to fall behind, but that brief glimpse was enough. The face was bloated. The skin had been altered by prolonged exposure to seawater. The features looked swollen and distorted. Human, but changed. I remember freezing completely. 1 second I was relaxed. The next I was staring in disbelief. I probably said something out loud. Something along the lines of, "What the foo?" My mind refused to process it. Surely I had imagined it. Surely it had been something else. A log, debris, a trick of the light. Anything but what I thought I had just seen. I stood up and looked again. This time I focused on the surrounding water. And that's when I realized it wasn't my imagination. A short distance away, I saw another body, then something else. Floating debris. And then more. A lot more. Scattered across the water were dead cattle. Not one or two. Dozens, perhaps more. Bodies drifting across the surface of the ocean. The sight was so unexpected that it felt unreal. The peaceful scene from moments earlier vanished completely. Now all I could think about was one question. What happened here? The ocean around us suddenly felt different. Not peaceful, not beautiful, just vast and unsettling. I removed my headphones immediately. The music felt inappropriate now. The entire mood had shifted. I hurried inside and found a phone. Then I called the bridge. Trying to explain what I had seen felt strange, because part of me still couldn't believe it myself. I reported the bodies, the debris, the cattle. Everything. The response surprised me. They already knew, or at least they suspected what we were looking at. Information had apparently reached the ship about a maritime disaster in the area. A transport vessel had gone down. As details emerged, the horrifying picture became clearer. The cattle we were seeing had been cargo. The bodies belonged to people aboard the vessel. Somewhere nearby, beneath the surface, lay the remains of the ship itself. Later, our crew sent a boat to investigate. Part of the vessel's hull remained visible above the water. Even damaged and partially submerged, it was large enough to be located. The investigation was grim. Everyone hoped there might be survivors. Even one. A life raft. A signal. Something. Anything. But there was nothing. No survivors. No signs that anyone had escaped. Only wreckage. The reality of that hit harder as the day went on. Hours earlier, those people had been alive, working, talking, eating, planning for tomorrow. Then something happened, and now they were gone. The ocean had swallowed everything. The scale of it was difficult to comprehend. When tragedies happen on land, there are roads, buildings, emergency services, witnesses. At sea, things feel different. The ocean doesn't preserve evidence. It doesn't leave obvious reminders. It simply continues. The waves keep moving. The horizon remains unchanged. And unless you happen to sail directly through the aftermath, you would never know anything happened at all. That's what stayed with me most. The contrast. One moment I was sitting peacefully in the sunshine listening to music. The next I was staring into the face of someone whose life had ended somewhere out there. A complete stranger, someone with a family, someone with friends. Someone who probably never imagined they would become a brief, haunting image in the memory of a sailor passing by. Years later, I still remember every detail. The warmth of the sun, the sound of Bob Marley playing through my headphones, the spray hitting my boots, the endless blue water, and then that face, appearing suddenly from the sea, the moment that transformed an ordinary day into something I will never forget. People often think of the ocean as beautiful, and it is. I've seen incredible sunrises at sea. I've watched dolphins race alongside ships. I've witnessed views most people never get the chance to experience. But the ocean is also indifferent. completely indifferent. It can be breathtakingly beautiful one moment and devastating the next. That day reminded me of that reality in a way I'll never forget. I started the afternoon relaxing on the edge of a ship with music in my ears. I ended it staring at the aftermath of a tragedy hidden within thousands of miles of open water. And every time I hear Bob Marley now, a small part of me is transported back to that sunny afternoon in the Indian Ocean, looking down over the side of a ship and realizing that the face staring back at me was real. When I was 11 years old, I experienced something that still bothers me today. I'm 31 now, and despite all the years that have passed, I can still remember every detail with surprising clarity. I've told this story a handful of times over the years, and most people immediately assume it was sleep paralysis. That's the first explanation everyone jumps to. The problem is that it wasn't. I was awake. I could move. I could speak. And, perhaps most importantly, I wasn't the only person who saw it. At the time, my sister and I shared a queen-sized bed. We didn't have separate rooms, so we slept in the same bedroom every night. The house we lived in wasn't particularly old or visually creepy, but strange things seemed to happen there on a regular basis. The first experience happened when my sister was away on vacation with our aunt. It was late at night, and I had been asleep when I suddenly woke up. At first, I wasn't sure why. The room was dark and quiet, and everything seemed normal. Then, I heard my name. At first, I thought I had imagined it. The voice sounded strange. It wasn't loud, but it wasn't soft either. It sounded raspy and distorted, almost like someone trying to speak through a damaged speaker. Then I heard my name again, and again. The repetition immediately got my attention. I sat up and looked toward the bedroom doorway. That's when I saw it. Something was standing there. Even now, decades later, I struggle to describe exactly what it looked like. It wasn't a person, at least not in any normal sense. It was tall enough to fill most of the doorway, and it appeared completely black. Not dark clothing, not a shadow cast by something else. Black, the kind of black that seemed to absorb the darkness around it. Its shape was vaguely human, but not clearly defined. The edges looked almost smoky or shadow-like, as if it couldn't quite hold a solid form. The thing just stood there, watching me, and repeating my name over and over. The voice was wrong in a way that's difficult to explain. It sounded rushed, almost frantic, and every repetition blended into the next. The best way I can describe it is a distorted, raspy whisper that somehow filled the room. I remember being terrified, completely terrified, but I could move. I could sit up. I could pull the blanket around myself. That's one of the reasons I've never believed it was sleep paralysis. Eventually, the thing disappeared. Or maybe I forced myself back to sleep. To be honest, that part is blurry. What wasn't blurry was the memory. For the next week, I couldn't stop thinking about it. I tried convincing myself that it had been a nightmare, a vivid dream, an overactive imagination, anything, because the alternative was much harder to accept. Then my sister came home from vacation. I didn't immediately tell her what had happened, partly because I felt ridiculous, partly because I wasn't sure how to explain it. Life returned to normal for several days. Then it happened again. One night I was asleep when someone nudged me. I opened my eyes and saw my sister staring toward the doorway. She looked terrified. Before I could ask what was wrong, she whispered something that made every hair on my body stand up. Can you hear that? My heart immediately started racing, because I already knew the answer. Then she asked another question. Can you see it? I slowly turned my head toward the doorway, and there it was. The exact same thing, standing in the same place, filling the doorway, watching us. Its form looked just as dark and shadowy as I remembered. The only details that stood out were what appeared to be eyes. They weren't glowing, they weren't bright. They looked more like pieces of burnt coal, dark, dull, and somehow still visible against the blackness surrounding them. The voice was there too, the same distorted rasp, the same rapid repetition. Except this time it wasn't just saying my name, it was saying both of our names. Again and again. My sister squeezed my arm so hard it hurt. Neither of us knew what to do. We just sat there staring, listening, frozen by fear. I don't know how long it lasted, maybe seconds, maybe minutes. When you're terrified, time becomes difficult to judge. Eventually it was gone. Just gone. No dramatic ending. No sudden movement. One moment it was there. The next it wasn't. The room became silent again. Neither of us slept much after that. The next morning we talked about what we had seen. The details matched perfectly. The shape. The voice. The eyes. Everything. That was the moment the experience stopped feeling like something I could explain away. If I had been the only person who saw it, I probably would have convinced myself it was a dream years ago. But my sister described the same thing before I had a chance to tell her anything. And that has always bothered me. The strange part is that this wasn't the only unusual thing that happened in that house. My brother had experiences of his own. He slept in a completely different room, yet he would sometimes wake up to find deep scratches carved into his bedpost. Nobody ever figured out where they came from. Years later, my mother started sharing stories too. One of the ones she talked about most often involved the shower. She said there were times when she would be washing her hair and suddenly feel something touching it. Not water. Not the shower curtain. Something that felt like fingers moving through her hair. Whenever she turned around, nobody was there. Then there were the nights she would come into our room convinced we were awake. She would storm in ready to scold us for talking or making noise, only to find both of us completely asleep. This happened more than once. According to her, she would clearly hear voices coming from our room. Yet every time she checked, neither of us had been awake. Looking back, the entire house seemed to have a reputation. Even after my family moved out, people never stayed there very long. My mother eventually rented the property out several times over the years. And according to her, tenants constantly wanted to leave early. Many didn't even make it 6 months. Most never provided a detailed explanation. They simply wanted out. Could all of this have ordinary explanations? Maybe. Old houses make strange noises. People misinterpret things. Memories become distorted over time. I understand all of that. But even now, when I think about that night, I don't immediately remember the shape standing in the doorway. I remember my sister waking me up. Because that's the moment everything changed. Until then, I could have dismissed my experience as a nightmare. A trick of the mind, an overactive imagination. The second she whispered, "Can you hear that? And can you see it?" those explanations became much harder to accept. To this day, I still don't know what we saw. I don't know what was standing in that doorway. I don't know why it called our names. And I don't know why so many strange things seem to happen in that house. All I know is that more than 20 years later, I can still picture that dark figure filling the doorway, its coal-like eyes fixed on us while it repeated our names in that distorted voice. And even now, that's enough to make me uncomfortable whenever I think about it too long. Of all the strange things I've experienced in my life, this is probably the one that bothers me the most, because I still can't come up with a reasonable explanation for it. I've replayed the event in my head hundreds of times over the years. every possible scenario, every logical explanation, every detail. And no matter how many times I think about it, I always end up at the same conclusion. I have absolutely no idea what happened that night. At the time, I was living alone. No roommates, no family members. Nobody else had access to the house. It was just me and my 3 pit bulls. Anyone who has owned pit bulls knows they can be incredibly affectionate. Mine loved sleeping in bed with me. Every night was basically a battle for blanket space, because all 3 dogs insisted on piling onto the bed. That particular night was no different. We went through our normal routine. I locked up the house, checked the doors, made sure everything was secure. Then I headed to bed. My bedroom door was closed and locked from the inside. That detail is important because I've considered every possibility involving an intruder, and the locked door always brings me back to square one. The room itself was simple. The bed sat in the middle of the room, directly beneath a ceiling fan. Like most ceiling fans, it had a pull chain hanging down to control the light. The chain hung low enough to reach if someone stood on the bed, but not low enough to accidentally hit while lying down. After getting comfortable, I fell asleep. Nothing unusual, nothing strange, just another normal night. At some point during the early hours of the morning, I suddenly woke up. Not gradually. Instantly. The reason I woke up was because I heard a sound. A very specific sound. The sound of the ceiling fan chain being pulled. If you've ever had one of those chains in your house, you know exactly what I mean. There's a distinct click when someone pulls it. It's not loud, but it's unmistakable. Even half asleep, I recognized it immediately. The moment I heard it, my eyes opened, and the first thing I noticed was that the room was no longer dark. The light was on. Bright, fully on. For a second, I just lay there trying to understand what was happening. Then I looked upward. The chain was still moving, swinging back and forth, not slightly, not barely moving, actually swinging, as though someone had just pulled it seconds earlier. I stared at it in complete confusion. The movement was impossible to miss. The chain continued swaying above me, while my brain desperately tried to catch up with reality. Then another realization hit me. In order for someone to pull that chain, they would have needed to be standing on the bed, directly above me. There was no other way to reach it. The fan hung over the center of the mattress. You couldn't reach it from the floor. You couldn't reach it from the doorway. You had to be on the bed. That realization immediately raised another problem. My dogs. All 3 pit bulls were still lying on the comforter, exactly where they had been sleeping. None of them were barking. None of them were growling. None of them even appeared disturbed. They looked as confused as I felt. Now, if you've ever accidentally stepped near a sleeping dog, you know they usually notice. 3 dogs sleeping on the bed would absolutely notice a person climbing onto the mattress, especially 3 pit bulls. Even if they didn't become aggressive, they would wake up. Move, react, something, yet all 3 remained calm. The more I thought about it, the stranger the situation became. Let's assume for a moment there had been an intruder. To pull that chain, the person would have needed to enter the house, then enter my bedroom, then somehow unlock or bypass a locked door, then climb onto a bed occupied by 1 sleeping adult and 3 large dogs, then pull the chain, then disappear, all without making enough noise to wake anyone. The scenario made no sense, and that's assuming they somehow vanished in the few seconds between me hearing the sound and opening my eyes. I immediately looked around the room. Nothing, nobody. The bedroom was empty. The door remained closed. The lock was still engaged. Every window was shut. There was nowhere for anyone to hide, yet the light was on. and the chain was moving. I remember sitting up slowly and staring at it, trying to come up with a rational explanation. Maybe the chain had somehow become tangled and released itself. Maybe a vibration caused it to move. Maybe I had somehow turned on the light while sleeping. But none of those explanations fit what I had witnessed. I hadn't simply woken up to find the light on. I had heard the chain being pulled. Then immediately opened my eyes and watched it swinging. That sequence is what has always bothered me. The timing, the chain wasn't moving because something had happened minutes earlier. It was moving because something had happened seconds earlier. Something had activated that light. And I couldn't figure out what. The dogs didn't help either. Part of me expected them to react after I woke up. Maybe start barking. Maybe stare toward a corner of the room. Maybe indicate they noticed something. Instead, they simply looked around and settled back down, as if nothing unusual had happened. I eventually got out of bed and checked the entire house. Every room, every door, every window. Nothing. No signs of forced entry. No signs anyone had been there. Everything appeared exactly as I had left it before going to sleep. By the time I returned to the bedroom, the chain had finally stopped swinging. The room looked completely normal again. Light on. Dogs. Asleep. Silence, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something impossible had just occurred. Years have passed since then. I've told the story to friends and family. Most people offer logical explanations. Some suggest I dreamed the sound. Others think I woke up in the middle of the chain's movement and connected unrelated events together. A few insist there has to be a mechanical explanation. Maybe they're right. Honestly, I hope they're right, because every alternative explanation is much harder to accept. The truth is that I don't claim to know what happened. I don't think a ghost climbed onto my bed. I don't think some supernatural force specifically wanted to turn on my bedroom light. I simply know what I experienced. I was asleep. I heard the chain being pulled. I opened my eyes. The light was on. The chain was swinging. And somehow 3 pit bulls slept through something that should have required a person standing directly over all of us. To this day, that's the part I can't get past, not the light. Not the chain. The dogs. Because if there had really been someone in that room, there's no chance all 3 of them would have stayed quiet. And that's why, after all these years, the memory still bothers me. Not because it was terrifying, because it made absolutely no sense. And sometimes the things you can't explain are the ones that stay with you the longest. When I was a little kid growing up in the countryside, one of my favorite things to do was chase after piglets whenever they managed to wander out of their pen. Looking back now, it probably sounds strange, but to me it was one of the most exciting parts of the day. I loved animals, and piglets were especially fun because they were small, fast, and always seemed to be getting into trouble. Whenever I spotted one running loose around the yard, I would immediately take off after it, determined to catch it before anyone else did. Most of the time, the piglets would squeal and run in circles while I chased them through the grass. Eventually, I would manage to corner one and carefully scoop it up into my arms. They always felt surprisingly warm and heavy for their size. Once I had caught one, I would carry it around like it was a prized trophy. Sometimes, I would put a piglet in my little red wagon and slowly pull it around the yard while pretending I was driving an important passenger somewhere. Other times, I would simply sit and hold it for a while before putting it back where it belonged. To me, it was harmless fun. I was just a kid looking for adventure in the simple world around me. The piglets usually seemed more annoyed than frightened, and nothing bad had ever happened before. Because of that, I never thought twice about what their mothers might think of me carrying their babies around. One afternoon, however, everything changed. It was a warm day, and I was outside playing by myself when I noticed a piglet wandering farther away from the pen than usual. It was rooting around in the dirt near the edge of the yard. The moment I saw it, I felt the familiar excitement rush through me. Without thinking, I started moving toward it. The piglet spotted me and immediately tried to run. I laughed and chased after it. The little thing darted left and right, squealing loudly as it tried to escape. For several minutes, we played our usual game of chase across the yard. Finally, I managed to catch it and lift it into my arms. The piglet kicked and squealed, but I was used to that. I held it securely and started walking back toward the house. At first, everything seemed normal. Then I heard a sound. It was a loud, angry grunt, unlike anything I had heard before. I turned my head and immediately felt my stomach drop. Standing near the pen was the piglet's mother. Even from a distance, I could tell she was furious. Most of the pigs on our property were fairly calm. They might grunt or pace around when something upset them, but this sow looked different. She looked absolutely enraged. Her entire body seemed tense. Her ears were pulled back, and her eyes were fixed directly on me. For a second, I froze. Then she charged. I had never seen anything move that fast. The sow slammed into the electric fence surrounding the pen with enough force to break through it. I remember hearing the snapping sound of wire and posts being knocked aside. One moment she was inside the enclosure, and the next she was racing straight toward me. The piglet in my arms squealed even louder. My heart nearly stopped. I realized immediately that I was in serious trouble. As a child, I had no chance of outrunning an angry sow. Even then, I understood that. She was bigger, faster, and stronger than I was. The distance between us was shrinking rapidly. Panic took over. I dropped the piglet onto the ground and looked desperately for somewhere to go. The nearest thing was a tree. Without hesitation, I sprinted toward it. I don't remember deciding to climb. I just remember grabbing the trunk and scrambling upward as fast as I possibly could. I must have climbed higher than I had ever climbed before. My hands were shaking. My legs were shaking. My heart felt like it was trying to pound its way out of my chest. When I finally stopped and looked down, the sow had reached the tree. The piglet had already run back to her. By all rights, that should have been the end of it. She had her baby back. The danger should have passed. But it didn't. Instead of leaving, she remained there beneath the tree. She stared up at me. To this day, I can still remember that moment with frightening clarity. I know how it sounds. I know what people usually say when they hear this story. They say it was sunlight reflecting off her eyes. They say I was scared and imagined things. They say childhood memories can become distorted over time. Maybe, but I can only tell you what I remember seeing. As I looked down at that sow, her eyes appeared to glow red, not just reflect light. Glow. The color seemed unnatural. I remember feeling an icy sensation run through my entire body as I stared back at her. The fear I felt wasn't just because she had charged me. It was something else, something harder to explain. She seemed aware, not animal aware, almost human aware. She watched me with an expression that felt deliberate and calculating. Even though she had recovered her piglet, she didn't leave. She simply stood there and stared. Then she did something I had never seen a pig do before. Her lips curled back slowly. I expected to see normal pig teeth. Instead, in that moment, they looked sharp and predatory. The closest comparison my frightened child mind could make was a wolf. her face twisted into something that looked less like a farm animal and more like a predator, warning me to stay away. Then, she made a sound. I still struggle to describe it. It wasn't a grunt. It wasn't a squeal. It was a low, hostile snarl. The sound sent chills through me. I remember gripping the tree branch so tightly that my fingers hurt. Every instinct told me not to come down. The sow stayed there for what felt like forever. In reality, it was probably only a few minutes. Eventually, she gathered her piglet and moved away. Even then, I refused to climb down immediately. I stayed in that tree until I was absolutely certain she was gone. When I finally returned to the house, I was shaken. I ran inside and told my mother everything. I explained how the sow had broken through the electric fence. I described the charge, the glowing eyes, the strange snarl, and the terrifying look she had given me. My mother listened for a moment before shaking her head. She told me I had an overactive imagination. She said I had frightened myself. She insisted that pigs don't have glowing eyes and don't turn into monsters. As far as she was concerned, I was simply telling another one of my wild childhood stories. I remember feeling frustrated because I knew what I had seen. At least, I believed I did. Years passed, and eventually the memory faded into the background like many childhood experiences do. But then something happened that brought those feelings rushing back. I was older by then. Not an adult yet, but old enough to walk around town by myself. One afternoon, I was walking along a sidewalk minding my own business. It was an ordinary day. The weather was pleasant. People were going about their lives. Nothing seemed unusual. As I walked past a house, I noticed a dog standing in a yard. At first, I paid little attention to it. Dogs were everywhere. Then, the dog looked directly at me. The moment our eyes met, I felt a familiar knot form in my stomach. The dog wasn't barking. It wasn't growling. It was simply staring. The intensity of that stare reminded me instantly of the sow from years earlier. I slowed my pace. The dog took a step closer. Then, another. Something about its posture felt wrong. Every hair on my arm stood up. I remember thinking that I should keep moving. So I did. I continued walking without making any sudden movements. The dog followed me along the edge of the property. Its eyes never left me. Then I noticed something that sent a chill through me. Its eyes appeared red, not bright like a flashlight, not cartoonishly glowing, but there was a strange reddish shine to them that looked disturbingly similar to what I remembered from childhood. The dog's expression seemed filled with hostility. I can't explain it any other way. Animals communicate differently than people, but sometimes you can tell exactly what they're feeling. This dog looked like it hated me. Not because I had threatened it, not because I had entered its territory. I was simply walking down the sidewalk. Yet it watched me with an intensity that felt deeply unsettling. I picked up my pace. The dog mirrored my movement. For several long seconds, I was convinced it was going to come after me. Fortunately, it never crossed the property line. Eventually, I passed beyond its yard and continued down the street. Only then did the feeling begin to fade. Even now, many years later, I still think about those two encounters. Maybe there are perfectly reasonable explanations. Perhaps the sunlight created strange reflections. Perhaps fear caused my brain to exaggerate certain details. Perhaps childhood memories become more dramatic over time. I can't rule any of that out. What I can say is that both experiences felt absolutely real in the moment. The terror I felt wasn't imaginary. The sense of danger wasn't imaginary. Both the sow and the dog seemed capable of doing serious harm if they had reached me. The sow had already proven how determined she was by smashing through an electric fence to protect her piglet. If I hadn't found that tree when I did, I honestly don't know what would have happened. Maybe she would have knocked me down. Maybe she would have trampled me. Maybe I would have escaped with nothing more than a few bruises. Or maybe it would have been much worse. The same thought crosses my mind when I remember that dog. There was something about its stare that convinced me I was not looking at a friendly animal. Every instinct I possessed told me to get away from it as quickly as possible. People often talk about trusting their instincts when something feels wrong. Those two moments are why I believe that advice. Whether the glowing eyes were real or simply tricks of light, whether the snarls were as unusual as I remember or not, the danger itself was real enough. I still remember the fear, the racing heartbeat, and the overwhelming certainty that I needed to get away. And sometimes, when I think back to those moments, I wonder what would have happened if that tree hadn't been nearby, or if that dog had decided to leave its yard. Maybe nothing. Maybe everything. But one thing is certain. Those experiences stayed with me for the rest of my life. Even now, whenever I see an animal staring a little too intensely or behaving in a way that feels unusual, I remember the angry sow beneath that tree and the dog standing silently at the edge of that yard. And for just a moment, I feel the same cold shiver that ran through me all those years ago. I've rewritten the story according to your requirements. No headings, no bold text, simple natural English, smooth flow, expanded details, and written as a long YouTube-style narrative for a USA, UK, Canada audience. When I was around 20 years old, one of the strangest experiences of my life happened during what should have been a completely ordinary drive. Even after all these years, I still think about it from time to time, because neither my friend nor I have ever been able to come up with a reasonable explanation for what we saw that night. At the time, my friend and I spent a lot of evenings driving around together. We lived in a small area where there wasn't always much to do, so sometimes we would just get in the car, listen to music, talk about life, and drive for a while. It was relaxing, and it gave us a chance to unwind after work or school. That particular night seemed no different from any other. The weather was calm, and the roads were mostly empty. There wasn't any rain, fog, or storm that could have affected visibility. The sky was dark, but that was normal for the area. We had driven those roads countless times before, and knew them extremely well. One thing I always make sure to mention whenever I tell this story is that neither of us had been drinking. We weren't using drugs, and we weren't sleep deprived. We were completely sober and alert. That's important, because whenever people hear unusual stories like this, they immediately assume someone must have been under the influence of something. We weren't. I was driving, and my friend was sitting in the passenger seat. We were talking casually about random things, the way friends do during long drives. Nothing about the evening felt unusual or unsettling. As we continued along the road, we approached a stretch that was very familiar to both of us. We had driven there dozens, maybe even hundreds of times. There were no sharp turns, no dangerous cliffs, and no areas where the road suddenly disappeared. It was a completely normal section of roadway. Then, without warning, something happened. 1 second, I was driving normally. The next second, it looked like the road simply ended. I don't mean that it became difficult to see. I don't mean there was a shadow or a dark patch. I mean it genuinely appeared as though the road had vanished entirely. The best way I can describe it is that it looked like a giant black void had opened up directly in front of us. The darkness wasn't normal nighttime darkness. It looked different somehow. It was deeper and more solid. almost like a physical object. It reminded me of looking into a bottomless pit or an endless empty space where nothing existed. The road ahead seemed to drop off into complete blackness. For a split second, my brain struggled to process what I was seeing. I knew there was supposed to be road there. I knew that stretch of highway. But my eyes were telling me something completely different. The image was so convincing that I reacted before I even had time to think. I slammed on the brakes. Hard, the tires gripped the pavement, and the car jerked forward as we rapidly slowed down. In that moment, I genuinely believed we were about to drive off the edge of something. My heart was pounding. Everything happened incredibly fast. I remember gripping the steering wheel tightly while staring straight ahead. I was fully expecting to discover that there was some kind of collapse in the road or an accident or something blocking our path. Instead, the moment the vehicle came to a complete stop, everything looked normal. The road was right there, exactly where it should have been. Flat, solid, completely ordinary. There was no hole, no cliff, no missing pavement, no black void. Nothing. The familiar road stretched ahead exactly as it always had. For several seconds, I just sat there staring. My heart was still racing from the sudden stop. I couldn't understand what had happened. I remember blinking several times and looking around, trying to make sense of what I had just seen. The entire thing felt impossible. At first, I assumed I must have experienced some kind of visual mistake. Maybe my eyes had played a trick on me. Maybe I had misinterpreted a shadow. Maybe I had imagined it. As strange as it was, that explanation seemed more likely than a road suddenly turning into a bottomless abyss. Then, I remembered my friend. I immediately felt embarrassed. From her perspective, I had probably looked completely insane. I had just slammed on the brakes in the middle of a perfectly normal road for no apparent reason. I started turning toward her, already preparing to apologize. I was expecting her to ask what I was doing. I was expecting confusion, maybe even laughter. Instead, before I could say anything, she spoke first. Her reaction completely changed everything. She looked shaken, not annoyed, not confused, shaken. The first thing she said was that she had seen it too. For a moment, I thought I had misheard her. I asked what she meant. She immediately described exactly what I had just witnessed. She said it looked like the road disappeared. She said it looked like there was nothing ahead of us except blackness. She admitted that she had been bracing herself because she thought we were about to drive straight off the road. The moment she said that, every hair on my arms stood up. Until then, I had been trying to convince myself that the experience had only happened in my head. But now, there were two of us. We had both seen the same thing. We had both reacted to it, and neither of us had mentioned it before the other. That detail has always stayed with me. If I had described it first, maybe I could have convinced myself that I accidentally influenced her memory. But that's not what happened. She brought it up immediately. Before I had a chance to explain what I thought I saw. Before I had a chance to ask any questions, she independently described the exact same impossible sight. We sat there for several moments discussing what had happened. Neither of us could understand it. The road ahead remained completely normal. There wasn't anything unusual about the lighting. There weren't any large shadows. No vehicles were positioned in a way that could explain the effect. Everything looked exactly as it should have looked. Eventually, we continued driving. What else could we do? But the mood had completely changed. The casual conversation from earlier was gone. Instead, we kept returning to the same topic. What did we actually see? Neither of us had an answer. The more we talked about it, the stranger it seemed. Our descriptions matched almost perfectly. We both described the darkness as unnatural. We both described the sensation that the road had vanished. We both genuinely believed there was no safe path ahead of us. Most importantly, we both reacted before hearing the other's opinion. That has always been the detail that bothers me the most. Human memory is imperfect. People influence each other all the time, but in this case, our reactions happened simultaneously. I slammed on the brakes because I believed the road had disappeared. She braced herself because she believed we were about to drive off the edge. Neither of us had time to discuss it beforehand. Years have passed since that night, and I've considered every explanation I can think of. Maybe there was some unusual lighting condition that briefly created an illusion. Maybe our headlights hit the road at a strange angle. Maybe there was a visual phenomenon neither of us understood. Those explanations are certainly possible. The human brain can be fooled in surprising ways. But even if that's true, it still doesn't explain why the illusion was so powerful. It wasn't a vague shape or a momentary shadow. It felt absolutely real. The image was convincing enough to trigger an immediate emergency response. My brain wasn't thinking, "That's strange." My brain was thinking, "Stop the car right now." Even today, I can picture the scene clearly. The dark road, the headlights, the sudden appearance of what looked like endless black emptiness directly ahead, the jolt of fear, the violent press of the brake pedal, the confusion afterward. And then the shock of hearing my friend confirm that she had witnessed exactly the same thing. Whenever people tell strange stories, there is usually some detail that allows you to dismiss it. Someone was tired. Someone had been drinking. Someone was alone. Someone only caught a brief glimpse. This experience didn't have any of those factors. There were two witnesses, both sober, both familiar with the area, both seeing the same thing at the same time. That's why the memory has stayed with me for so long. I'm not claiming anything supernatural happened. I honestly don't know what happened. Maybe there is a perfectly logical explanation waiting to be discovered. Maybe some expert in human perception could explain exactly why two people might simultaneously experience the same visual illusion. I would actually love to hear that explanation. But until then, it remains one of the strangest moments of my life. It lasted only a few seconds. There was no dramatic ending. No mysterious figure appeared. Nothing chased us. The road simply seemed to vanish and then return to normal the moment we stopped. Yet somehow that brief experience has remained more memorable than countless other events from that period of my life. Even now, whenever I drive at night on a lonely road, I occasionally think about it. I'll be looking ahead at the headlights illuminating the pavement, and for a moment I'll remember that strange black void. I'll remember the feeling of certainty that there was nothing in front of us. And I'll remember turning to my friend, expecting her to think I was crazy, only to discover that she had seen exactly the same impossible thing. To this day, neither of us has ever found an explanation that fully satisfies us. All we know is that for a few seconds on an ordinary night, on a road we knew well, reality seemed to stop making sense. Then, just as suddenly as it began, everything returned to normal, leaving us with a memory that neither of us has ever been able to forget. When I was a child, I experienced something that has stayed with me for the rest of my life. Even now, years later, I can still remember it with surprising clarity. I've tried many times to explain it away or convince myself that it was simply a dream. But the memory feels different from any dream I have ever had. It felt real in every possible way. And that is what has always bothered me. At the time, I was very young. I don't remember my exact age, but I was still at the stage where bedtime felt like an event all on its own. My room wasn't particularly unusual. It looked like any ordinary child's bedroom. There was a bed against one wall, a few toys scattered around, a dresser, and a closet near the corner of the room. During the day, the closet was completely normal. It held clothes, shoes, and random items that my parents stored there. Nothing about it ever seemed strange. Like many children, however, I wasn't always comfortable with the dark. My imagination could turn ordinary objects into strange shapes once the lights went out. A pile of clothes might look like a person standing in the corner. A coat hanging on a hook could resemble some kind of creature watching from the shadows. Even so, I knew the difference between imagination and reality. At least, I thought I did. One night, I was lying awake in bed long after I was supposed to be asleep. The house was quiet. My parents were in their room, and the familiar sounds of the day had faded away. The only noise came from the occasional creak that old houses make at night. I was staring across the room, not really thinking about anything in particular, when I noticed something unusual. At first, it was just movement, a slight motion near the closet. I remember narrowing my eyes and focusing on the darkness. For a moment, I thought maybe a shirt hanging inside the closet had shifted somehow. But then I realized the movement wasn't random. Something was coming out of the closet. I sat up slightly in bed. The room suddenly felt colder. As I stared toward the closet, I saw what looked like dark figures emerging one after another. Even now, that image remains crystal clear in my memory. They were tall, far taller than any normal person. Their bodies were unnaturally thin, almost impossibly thin. Their arms and legs looked stretched, like shadows that had been pulled too tightly. They didn't look like solid people. They looked more like dark silhouettes cut out of the darkness itself. What frightened me most wasn't their appearance. It was the way they moved. Each figure marched forward in perfect synchronization. Every step matched the others exactly. Every movement was precise. There was no hesitation, no variation, no individuality. It was as if they were part of a single machine. One after another, they emerged from the darkness of the closet and began marching across my room. I remember being frozen with confusion. Part of me wanted to scream immediately. Another part of me couldn't believe what I was seeing. I simply stared. The figures continued their march. Then I noticed something even stranger. I could hear them. Their footsteps weren't silent. Each time one of them stepped forward, I heard a distinct stomping sound. Thump, 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 the rhythm echoed through the room. At first, I thought maybe the sound was only in my head. Then, I felt it. The vibrations seemed to travel through the floor beneath me. The carpet under my bed felt as though it was trembling slightly with each synchronized step. That detail is one of the reasons the memory has never left me. Dreams often blur together over time. But I can still remember hearing those footsteps. I can still remember feeling them. The combination of sight, sound, and sensation made the experience feel overwhelmingly real. The figures continued marching in perfect formation. They never spoke. They never looked at each other. They simply moved forward with mechanical precision. As a child, I had never seen anything like it. Fear slowly built inside me. My heart began pounding harder and harder. I remember clutching my blanket tightly. Every instinct told me that something was terribly wrong. Yet I couldn't move. I couldn't look away. The sight was horrifying, but it was also strangely mesmerizing. Then something happened that transformed my fear into pure terror. Without meaning to, I gasped. It wasn't a loud scream, just a sudden intake of breath. A small sound. But in the silence of the room, it felt enormous. The instant that sound left my mouth, every single figure stopped. Not one after another, not with a delay, all at once. The marching ended immediately. The room became completely silent. For a moment, nothing moved. Then, in perfect unison, every figure snapped its head toward me. The movement was so sudden and unnatural that it felt impossible. One moment they were facing forward. The next moment they were staring directly at me. I can still remember the shock that ran through my body. It felt as though every drop of blood had turned to ice. I had the overwhelming feeling that they knew I had been watching them. The figures didn't have faces that I could clearly see, at least not in the normal sense. They were mostly darkness. But somehow I knew they were looking directly at me. The attention felt focused, intentional, as though they had only just become aware of my presence. The room suddenly seemed much smaller. My chest tightened. I couldn't breathe properly. I had never felt fear like that before. Every childhood fear, every nightmare, every scary story I had ever heard seemed insignificant compared to the terror of that moment. The figures remained motionless, watching, waiting. I didn't know what they were going to do next. I didn't want to find out. Acting purely on instinct, I squeezed my eyes shut as tightly as I could. I pulled the blanket up toward my face and held perfectly still. I remember silently begging for whatever I was seeing to disappear. Seconds passed. Or maybe it was longer. Time felt strange. Fear has a way of stretching moments into eternity. My heart hammered inside my chest. I could hear my own breathing. I waited. Eventually, I gathered enough courage to slowly open my eyes. The room was exactly as it had always been. The closet stood quietly in the corner. The carpet was still. The shadows were gone. There were no marching figures, no footsteps, no vibrations, nothing. The entire room looked completely normal. For several moments, I simply stared. I expected the figures to reappear at any second. I expected movement. I expected another sound. But nothing happened. The silence returned. The ordinary silence of a sleeping house. I remember staying awake for a long time afterward. Every creak of the house made me jump. Every shifting shadow caught my attention. Eventually, exhaustion must have taken over because I finally fell asleep. The next morning, I immediately told my parents what had happened. I described the tall figures. I described the marching. I described hearing and feeling their footsteps. Most importantly, I described the moment they all stopped and turned toward me. My parents listened patiently. Then they gave the explanation that most parents would probably give. They told me I had been dreaming. According to them, I had likely experienced a nightmare and confused it with reality. At my age, that explanation made sense to them. Children have vivid imaginations. Children have strange dreams. Children sometimes wake up frightened and convinced something happened when it didn't. Looking back, I understand why they responded that way. If my own child told me a story like that, I would probably look for a logical explanation too. The problem is that the experience never felt like a dream. Even now, after all these years, it doesn't. I've had countless dreams in my life. Good dreams, bad dreams, terrifying nightmares. They all share a certain quality. They feel different from waking memories. This experience never felt that way. It felt like a real memory. A memory of lying awake in my room and watching something impossible happen. Of course, memory isn't perfect. Human perception isn't perfect either. I fully admit that there may be explanations I don't understand. Maybe I was half asleep. Maybe my young brain interpreted ordinary shadows in a strange way. Maybe there was some combination of imagination and fear that created an experience that felt completely real. Those explanations are certainly possible. But even if that's true, the memory itself remains remarkably vivid. What stands out most isn't the appearance of the figures. It's the moment they reacted to me. The moment I gasped. The moment they all stopped simultaneously. The moment they turned. That is the part I remember most clearly. That is the image that occasionally returns to me late at night when I find myself thinking about strange experiences from childhood. The encounter never happened again, not once. I slept in the same room for years afterward. The closet remained exactly where it had always been. Nothing else unusual ever emerged from it. There were no more marching shadows, no more footsteps, no more impossible figures crossing the room. Whatever happened that night was limited to a single experience. Yet somehow, that one experience was enough. Because even though decades may pass, some childhood memories never truly disappear. Most memories fade around the edges. Details become blurry. Faces become harder to remember. But some moments remain frozen in time. For me, one of those moments is lying awake in a dark bedroom, watching a line of impossibly tall shadow figures march silently from my closet, hearing their footsteps echo through the room, and feeling absolute terror when they suddenly stopped and turned to look directly at me. Whether it was a dream, a trick of the mind, or something I will never understand, I still remember it as clearly as if it happened yesterday. And every now and then, when I wake up in the middle of the night and see shadows stretching across a dark room, I find myself thinking back to that childhood experience and wondering what I really saw. I have had two experiences in my life that I still can't fully explain. Even now, years later, I occasionally find myself thinking about them late at night. Maybe there are logical explanations for both events. Maybe fear, imagination, and coincidence played bigger roles than I realized at the time. But regardless of what caused them, they remain two of the strangest memories I have ever carried with me. The first experience happened when I was very young. At the time, my parents and I shared the same bedroom. We weren't wealthy, and our living situation meant that all three of us slept in a single room. The layout was simple. My small bed was positioned close to the doorway. My parents' bed sat directly behind mine, running horizontally across the room. If I got out of bed, I only needed to take a few steps before I was at the door. Because of how close our beds were, I always felt safe at night. If I needed something, my parents were right there. If I had a nightmare, all I had to do was call out to them. One night, however, that feeling of safety disappeared. I remember lying awake long after I should have been asleep. The room was completely dark, except for a small amount of moonlight slipping through the curtains. The house was quiet. My parents were asleep behind me, and I could hear the faint sound of their breathing. I wasn't scared at first. I was simply awake. As I stared into the darkness, my eyes slowly adjusted to the room. Shapes that had once been hidden began to emerge. The outline of furniture became visible. The doorway became clearer. Then I noticed something standing near the foot of my bed. At first I thought it was a shadow, a trick of the darkness. But as I continued staring, the shape became more defined. It looked human, tall, much taller than any normal person. The figure appeared to be wearing a dark, hooded cloak that concealed most of its body. I couldn't make out a face, at least not at first. The figure simply stood there motionless. Watching, a cold feeling spread through my body. I wanted to call for my parents. I wanted to move, but fear had locked me in place. Then the figure stepped forward, slowly, deliberately. The movement was so smooth that it almost seemed unreal. As it emerged further from the darkness, I noticed something in its hand. A long handle, a curved blade, a scythe. At that age, I had never seen movies or books that featured the Grim Reaper. I had no knowledge of what the traditional image of death was supposed to look like. Yet somehow, standing in front of me was a figure that perfectly matched the description people would later give me. The closer it came, the more terrified I became. Then, I saw its eyes. They glowed red. Not brightly enough to illuminate the room, but bright enough to stand out against the darkness beneath the hood. Those eyes were fixed directly on me. I couldn't look away. The figure continued approaching until it stood beside my bed. I remember feeling completely helpless. Every muscle in my body seemed frozen. My heart was racing so fast that I thought I might pass out. Then, the figure reached out. Slowly, its skeletal-looking hand extended toward me. At the same time, it gripped the scythe with both hands. I watched in horror as it lifted the weapon above its head. The movement was unmistakable. It looked as though it was preparing to swing. The fear that hit me at that moment is impossible to describe. Until then, I had been frozen, unable to move, unable to speak, unable to scream. But something suddenly snapped inside me. Pure survival instinct took over. With every ounce of strength I had, I yanked the blanket over my head and screamed as loudly as possible. The sound that came out of me was so loud that it instantly woke my parents. Within seconds, I heard movement behind me. The lights came on. My parents rushed over to my bed. The figure was gone. The room was normal again. I was shaking uncontrollably. My parents tried to calm me down while asking what had happened. Through tears and panic, I described everything I had seen. The hooded figure, the red eyes, the scythe, the feeling that it had been about to strike me. My parents exchanged confused looks. Like most parents would, they assumed I had experienced a nightmare. They explained that I must have been dreaming. That seemed like the simplest answer. Then, something strange happened. As my mother adjusted the blanket, she noticed damage near the top edge. At first, nobody thought much about it. But when they examined it more closely, they realized something didn't make sense. The blanket wasn't torn. It was cut. The opening was straight and clean. The edges looked almost as if someone had used a pair of scissors. My parents immediately assumed I had somehow damaged it earlier without remembering. But even as a child, I knew something felt wrong about that explanation. When I had pulled the blanket over my head, I had done it with force. If the fabric had been damaged because of that movement, it should have stretched or ripped unevenly. Instead, the opening looked precise, neat, almost intentional. To this day, I have no explanation for it. Maybe there was already damage there that nobody had noticed before. Maybe there was a perfectly ordinary reason for the cut. I honestly don't know. All I know is that the memory of that night has never left me. Years later, another strange experience would leave an equally lasting impression. This one happened when I was older. A friend of mine became interested in ghost hunting. Personally, I never understood the appeal. If ghosts existed, I certainly wasn't interested in finding them. My friend, however, loved the idea. He watched videos, read stories online, and constantly talked about abandoned locations and haunted areas. One evening he convinced me to come along while he investigated a supposedly haunted spot outside town. Against my better judgment, I agreed. Looking back, that was probably my first mistake. The location was isolated, surrounded by trees and narrow roads. The kind of place that feels unsettling even during daylight. At night, it was even worse. The darkness seemed thicker out there. The silence felt heavier. When we arrived, my friend was excited. I was not. I had absolutely no interest in wandering around abandoned locations in the dark searching for ghosts. So I stayed in the car. He grabbed his equipment and went exploring while I sat in the passenger seat waiting. Nothing happened for quite a while. Eventually, he returned. He seemed disappointed. Apparently, he hadn't found anything unusual. No strange sounds. No mysterious figures. No paranormal activity. On the drive home, he started making jokes about it. He laughed about ghost hunters. He laughed about haunted locations. He even started mocking the idea of spirits entirely. The problem was that he wasn't just joking. He was actively trying to provoke something. He began talking out loud to imaginary ghosts, daring them to do something. I remembered telling him that it was a bad idea. Whether ghosts existed or not, it felt disrespectful. He just laughed. My friend drove a manual transmission vehicle. As we traveled down a narrow road surrounded by trees, he started pretending that the car was being affected by supernatural forces. He would intentionally make the engine sputter. Then he'd laugh and claim a ghost was trying to stop us. A few minutes later, he did it again. The joke was becoming annoying. Finally, I turned toward him and said something like, "Keep messing around and something's actually going to happen." The moment those words left my mouth, everything changed. Instantly, the car shut off. Not gradually. Not like an engine stalling. Not like a mechanical problem slowly developing. It felt as though someone had reached over and flipped a giant switch. The entire vehicle died. The engine stopped. The lights flickered. Everything went silent. We came to an abrupt halt. For a few seconds, neither of us spoke. The suddenness of it was shocking. Then things became even stranger. Fog appeared, not in the distance, not rolling slowly across the road. It seemed to materialize around us almost immediately. Within moments, thick fog surrounded the vehicle. The windows disappeared behind a wall of gray. We couldn't see the road. We couldn't see the trees. We couldn't see anything. It was like sitting inside a cloud. The atmosphere inside the car changed instantly. All the joking stopped. My friend wasn't laughing anymore. His face had gone pale. He repeatedly tried restarting the car. Nothing happened. The silence outside felt overwhelming. No animals, no wind, nothing, just fog, endless fog. I remember sitting there thinking that if anything was going to happen, this was exactly how it would start. The entire situation felt unreal. My friend continued turning the key again, again, again. Each failed attempt made him more nervous. I was trying to stay calm, but internally I was just as scared. The road was isolated, the visibility was gone, the car wasn't working, and the timing felt impossible. The engine had died at the exact moment I warned him to stop provoking whatever might be out there. Finally, after what felt like forever, the engine came back to life. The sound was the most beautiful thing I had ever heard. Neither of us wasted a second. My friend immediately put the car into gear. We got out of there as fast as possible. As we drove away, the fog gradually became thinner until eventually everything looked normal again. Neither of us said much during the rest of the trip. The mood had completely changed. The confidence and jokes were gone. By the time we got back home, neither of us wanted to discuss what had happened. Even now, I can still remember the feeling of sitting inside that stalled car surrounded by fog so thick that the world beyond the windows seemed to vanish. Maybe there are logical explanations for both of these experiences. Maybe the figure I saw as a child was a nightmare, mixed with reality. Maybe the blanket damage was a coincidence. Maybe the car suffered a temporary mechanical failure. Maybe the fog rolled in naturally at exactly the wrong moment. Those explanations are entirely possible. But what makes both memories stick with me is the timing, the details, the feeling that, for a brief moment, reality stopped behaving the way it was supposed to, whether supernatural or not. Those are two experiences I have never forgotten. And every now and then, when I'm lying awake late at night, I find myself wondering if there was more to those events than coincidence. There are certain moments in life that last only a fraction of a second yet stay with you forever. Most days come and go without leaving much of an impression. We forget routine drives, ordinary conversations, and countless uneventful hours. But every once in a while, something happens so suddenly and so unexpectedly that your brain permanently files it away as a warning. For me, that moment happened on a lonely highway in the middle of the night. It wasn't supernatural. It wasn't paranormal. In many ways, it was far more terrifying than any ghost story because it was completely real. One small difference in timing, and I probably wouldn't be here to tell the story. The road itself was familiar. It was one of those highways that seem endless after dark. Each direction had 2 lanes, separated by a wide median. The road stretched straight ahead for miles, without any significant curves or hills. During the daytime, it was an easy drive. At night, however, it felt isolated. The darkness beyond the pavement seemed endless. There weren't many other vehicles around that night. In fact, the road was almost empty. The only vehicle near me was a car traveling ahead in the same direction. It wasn't far away, maybe 10 car lengths or so. Close enough that I could clearly see its taillights, but far enough that there was a small section of darkness between us, untouched by either set of headlights. We were both traveling in the right lane. Everything felt normal. The weather was clear. The road conditions were good. Traffic was practically non-existent. I was relaxed and simply focused on getting where I needed to go. At that point, there was absolutely no reason to feel nervous. The drive had been uneventful for quite a while. I remember watching the red taillights ahead of me glowing steadily against the darkness. Out on a highway at night, you sometimes find yourself staring at those lights almost hypnotically. They become a point of reference in the darkness. The miles passed quietly. Then something happened. Even now, years later, I can replay the exact sequence of events in my mind. It began with a brief glimpse, a fraction of a second. So quick that if I had blinked, I might have missed it entirely. Ahead of me, illuminated by the headlights of the vehicle in front, I noticed something in the left lane. At first, my brain couldn't process what I was seeing. It appeared only briefly within the beam of the other driver's headlights. A shape. A dark object. Something moving. Then, it vanished back into darkness. The sight was so fleeting that I almost dismissed it immediately. But before my brain could decide what it was, the object entered the reach of my own headlights. And suddenly, everything became clear. It was a car. A car driving directly toward us. A car traveling the wrong way. A car with no headlights. For a split second, my brain refused to accept what my eyes were showing me. There was no logical reason for a vehicle to be there. No logical reason for it to be facing the wrong direction. And absolutely no reason for it to be driving at highway speeds without lights. Yet there it was. The vehicle appeared out of the darkness like something materializing from nowhere. I only saw it for a fraction of a second. Less than a quarter of a second, probably, but that was enough. The image burned itself permanently into my memory. I can still remember exactly how it looked. The dark outline, the sudden realization, the shock, the overwhelming understanding of what almost happened. The car shot past in the left lane and disappeared behind us before my brain had fully processed the danger. Everything happened too fast for panic, too fast for fear. too fast for any real reaction at all. One moment the road was empty. The next moment there was a wrong-way vehicle hurtling toward us out of complete darkness. Then, it was gone. The entire event lasted less time than it takes to take a breath. For several seconds afterward, I simply sat there, gripping the steering wheel. My heart was pounding. The reality of what had just happened began slowly catching up with me. I glanced into my mirrors. Nothing. The darkness swallowed the vehicle almost immediately. The road ahead remained unchanged. The taillights of the car in front continued glowing steadily, as though nothing unusual had happened. But for me, everything had changed. Because I realized something that made my stomach drop. If I had been in the left lane, there is a very good chance I would have died. The thought hit me with incredible force. I wasn't imagining a close call. I wasn't exaggerating the danger. The closing speed between two vehicles traveling toward one another on a highway is enormous. At those speeds, there would have been almost no time to react. No opportunity to brake effectively. No chance to swerve safely. No dramatic movie-style escape. Just impact. Violent and immediate. The more I thought about it, the more disturbing it became. The driver of that vehicle had no lights. Without the headlights from the car ahead of me, I might not have seen the vehicle at all until the final instant. In fact, the headlights of the other driver were probably the only reason I noticed it. Those headlights briefly illuminated the wrong-way vehicle before it entered my own field of vision. That tiny warning gave my brain just enough time to understand what I was seeing. It wasn't enough time to react. But it was enough time to realize how close disaster had been. For the rest of that drive, I felt completely different. My confidence disappeared. I found myself scanning the darkness constantly. Every distant reflection caught my attention. Every shadow seemed suspicious. The highway no longer felt safe. It felt unpredictable. The strange thing about near misses is that they often affect you more deeply than actual accidents. When something bad happens, there is a clear event to process. But when disaster almost happens, your mind begins imagining all the alternate outcomes. You start thinking about what could have happened. You imagine being one lane over. You imagine making a different decision 5 seconds earlier. You imagine how close you came without even knowing it. That night, I couldn't stop thinking about those possibilities. One lane. That was all that separated me from a potentially fatal collision. Just one lane. Most people probably wouldn't think twice about it afterward. They would chalk it up to bad luck and move on. I wasn't able to do that. Something about the experience stayed with me. Even now, years later, it influences how I drive at night. Whenever possible, I stay in the right lane. Logically, I know it isn't perfect protection. If a wrong-way driver decides to use my lane instead, the outcome could be exactly the same. I understand that. The rational part of my brain understands that danger doesn't follow simple rules. But fear isn't always rational. Fear remembers experiences. Fear remembers images. Fear remembers that dark shape suddenly appearing in the headlights. Every time I find myself driving on a lonely highway after dark, I think about that night. I think about the empty road, the quiet darkness, the red taillights ahead, and the split-second glimpse of a vehicle that should not have been there. People often assume traumatic experiences have to involve explosions, crashes, or dramatic moments of chaos. Sometimes they don't. Sometimes all it takes is a quarter of a second, a single image, a brief realization, a sudden understanding of how fragile life can be. What makes the memory so unsettling is how ordinary everything felt right before it happened. There were no warning signs, no sense of danger, no feeling that anything was wrong. One second I was simply driving home. The next second I was staring at a wrong-way vehicle emerging from complete darkness. Then, it was over. The road returned to normal. The night continued. The world moved on as if nothing had happened. But I never forgot it. Because every now and then, usually during a quiet drive after sunset, I'll find myself looking down a dark stretch of highway and remembering that moment. I'll remember how quickly everything changed. I'll remember how close I came to being in the wrong place at the wrong time. And I'll remember the sight of that dark car with no headlights racing toward me out of the darkness before vanishing just as suddenly as it appeared. It lasted less than a second. Yet it remains one of the most frightening things I have ever seen. One of the strangest experiences I've ever had happened when I was about 7 months pregnant. Even now, years later, I still don't know exactly what I saw. I've spent a lot of time trying to come up with a logical explanation, and maybe there is one. But no matter how much I try to rationalize it, the memory remains incredibly vivid. At the time, my husband and I were living on the Pearl Harbor military base in Hawaii. It was a unique place to live, full of history and stories that seemed to linger in the atmosphere. Everywhere you went, you were reminded of the events that had taken place there decades earlier. Historic buildings, memorials, and reminders of the attack on Pearl Harbor were woven into everyday life. I wasn't someone who believed strongly in ghosts or paranormal activity. In fact, I was usually the person trying to explain unusual events with logic and common sense. If someone told me they had seen a ghost, I would probably assume there was another explanation. That's why this experience has always bothered me. It wasn't because I believed something supernatural happened. It was because I couldn't easily explain it away. Pregnancy had already been an exhausting experience. By 7 months, I was carrying extra weight, struggling to get comfortable at night, and dealing with the usual challenges that come with being heavily pregnant. Sleep didn't come easily anymore. Some nights I would lie awake for long periods, just trying to find a comfortable position. One night I was lying in bed doing exactly that. The room was quiet. The lights were off. My husband was asleep beside me. I remember staring at the ceiling while trying to relax enough to drift off. At first, nothing seemed unusual. Then, I noticed something. There appeared to be a shape on the ceiling directly above me. At first glance, I assumed it was some kind of shadow, maybe a reflection from outside, maybe my tired eyes playing tricks on me. I wasn't concerned. But the longer I looked, the stranger it seemed. The shape wasn't random. It wasn't a patch of darkness or a strange shadow cast by furniture. It looked like a face, a very disturbing face. I remember immediately feeling uncomfortable. The image appeared almost like an outline made from pale white light. It wasn't solid. It wasn't detailed in the way an actual person would be. Instead, it looked more like those old optical illusion images that used to be popular years ago. I don't know if anyone else remembers them, but there were pictures where you'd stare at a series of dots or a brightly colored image for 30 seconds. Then, when you closed your eyes or looked at a blank surface, the image would appear floating in front of you. One of the most famous versions was an image of Jesus. You would stare at it, then look away, and suddenly the face would appear as a glowing outline. What I saw looked very similar to that effect. The difference was that I hadn't been staring at any image beforehand, and the face I was seeing wasn't remotely comforting. It looked sinister. The features appeared distorted and unnatural. The best description I can give is that it resembled a demonic face. The eyes looked hollow. The expression looked angry. The entire thing radiated an unsettling feeling that immediately made my skin crawl. For a few seconds, I simply stared at it. Then I reminded myself of something. I used to suffer from migraines that sometimes came with visual auras. Anyone who has experienced migraine auras knows how strange they can be. They can create flashing lights, blind spots, zigzag patterns, and all sorts of visual disturbances. Because of my history with migraines, that was the first explanation that came to mind. I told myself that was probably what I was seeing. A visual effect. Nothing more. The problem was that migraine auras always behaved in a certain way. They moved with my vision. No matter where I looked, the disturbance remained part of my visual field. This was different. This face was only on the ceiling. I remember deliberately testing it. I looked away. Then I looked back. The face was still there. I shifted my eyes to another part of the room. Nothing unusual. I looked back at the ceiling. Still there. The glowing outline remained in exactly the same place. That was when the fear started creeping in. I wasn't someone who frightened easily. I wasn't particularly superstitious. But there was something deeply unsettling about seeing a face staring down at me from the ceiling in the middle of the night. Especially a face that looked so unnatural. I tried blinking repeatedly. The image remained. I rubbed my eyes. Still there. I looked away for several seconds. Then looked back again. The face continued staring down from the same location. At that point, my heart had started racing. The room suddenly felt colder. The silence seemed heavier. I remember becoming acutely aware of every little sound in the house. The hum of distant air conditioning, the faint noises from outside, the sound of my own breathing. Everything seemed amplified. Meanwhile, the face remained exactly where it was. Watching, at least. That's how it felt. I know that sounds irrational. I know a shape on a ceiling can't actually watch someone. But fear doesn't operate on logic. Fear operates on instinct. And every instinct I had was telling me that something wasn't right. I considered waking my husband. Part of me wanted someone else to look at it and tell me what I was seeing. Another part of me was afraid to draw attention to it. As strange as that sounds, I worried that acknowledging it somehow might make the situation worse. So, I stayed where I was. Watching, waiting, trying to convince myself that exhaustion was the real culprit. After all, I was pregnant. I wasn't sleeping well. My body was under stress. My hormones were all over the place. Those explanations seemed far more reasonable than anything supernatural. Yet despite repeating those thoughts to myself, I couldn't shake the feeling of dread. The face simply looked wrong. Its expression felt hostile. Its presence felt intrusive. Eventually, I pulled the blanket higher and turned away from the ceiling. I remember lying there with my back turned, trying not to look. Every few minutes, curiosity would get the better of me, and I would glance back. Each time, the face seemed to remain exactly where it had been. I honestly don't remember how long the experience lasted. Maybe a few minutes, maybe longer. Time moves strangely when you're frightened. Eventually, either the image faded or I finally fell asleep. By morning, everything was normal. The ceiling looked exactly as it always had. There were no marks, no stains, no reflections, nothing that could explain what I had seen. The experience should have faded into the background after that, but it didn't. Years later, I can still picture the face clearly. Not because I think it was a ghost, not because I believe I encountered a demon, but because it felt so real at the time. Whenever I think back on it, I still find myself searching for explanations. Perhaps it really was a visual phenomenon caused by fatigue. Maybe pregnancy-related exhaustion affected my perception. Maybe it was some unusual interaction between light and shadow. Maybe my history of migraine auras played a role even though the experience didn't behave like previous auras. Those explanations are all possible. In fact, I hope one of them is correct. The alternative is much harder to understand. Living on Pearl Harbor certainly added another layer to the mystery. The base carries an immense amount of history. Thousands of lives were forever changed there. The stories of the past are impossible to ignore when you live in a place so deeply connected to one of the most significant events in American history. Sometimes I wonder if knowing that history influenced my perception. Maybe the awareness of where I lived made the experience seem more significant than it really was. Or maybe it was simply a coincidence that happened to occur in a place already surrounded by stories and legends. I honestly don't know. What I do know is that I have experienced migraines, exhaustion, stress, and vivid dreams throughout my life. None of them felt quite like that night. None of them involved looking up at a ceiling and seeing a glowing face that remained fixed in one place no matter where I moved my eyes. Even now, when I lie awake at night staring into darkness, I occasionally remember that experience. I remember the glowing outline. I remember the unsettling expression. I remember trying desperately to convince myself that I was imagining it. And most of all, I remember the feeling. That quiet, creeping fear that slowly builds when you're faced with something you can't explain. Whether it was a trick of the mind, an unusual visual phenomenon, or something else entirely, it remains one of the most disturbing experiences I've ever had. And after all these years, I still don't have an answer. I grew up around Kanab, Utah, a place that felt different from almost anywhere else I've ever been. People who haven't spent time there often imagine it as just another desert town, but it's hard to explain the feeling the landscape gives you when you've lived there. The area is beautiful, but it can also feel incredibly isolated. Endless stretches of red rock, dry desert, deep canyons, and open land stretch in every direction. Sometimes you can stand outside and look across miles of empty terrain without seeing another person. As a kid, that environment affected me in ways I didn't fully understand at the time. The desert has a strange personality. During the day, it can seem peaceful and almost magical. The red cliffs glow in the sunlight, and the sky feels larger than anywhere else on Earth. But when evening comes and the shadows begin to stretch across the landscape, the same beauty can become unsettling. There were times when it felt like the land itself didn't want people there. Of course, that sounds dramatic now, but anyone who has spent enough time in truly remote places understands what I mean. There's a certain feeling that comes from standing in a place so old, so vast, and so empty, that you begin to realize how small you really are. When I was around 13 or 14 years old, my friends and I spent most of our free time outside. We rode bikes, played sports, explored dirt roads, and wandered around places that would probably terrify our parents if they knew where we were. There were 5 of us in our group. We were typical teenage boys, competitive, loud, always trying to impress each other. The kind of kids who spent hours playing sports and challenging one another to races and contests. Because of that, we had a pretty good understanding of how fast a human being could move. We knew what sprinting looked like. We knew what running at full speed looked like. We knew what athletes were capable of. That's important to understand because of what happened one afternoon. It was a normal day. Nothing unusual had happened. We were hanging out together near a street in town, talking and joking around. I honestly can't remember what we were discussing before everything changed. What I do remember is seeing an old Navajo man standing across the street. At first, none of us paid much attention to him. There was nothing particularly unusual about his appearance. He simply stood there, watching us. Then we noticed something strange. He was laughing. Not loudly, not in a way that drew attention, just standing there with an expression that seemed almost amused, as though he knew something we didn't. One by one, we started noticing him. Eventually, all 5 of us were looking in his direction. The moment we acknowledged him, everything changed. I wish I could explain it better. I've spent years trying to describe exactly what happened. Whenever I tell this story, people immediately assume I mean he ran away quickly. That's not what I mean. If he had simply been fast, none of us would still be talking about it decades later. What happened felt fundamentally wrong. The instant he realized we were looking directly at him, he moved. But it didn't look like normal movement. It wasn't running. Not really. It looked more like something grabbed him and pulled him away. Imagine watching someone sprint. Now imagine increasing that speed far beyond what seems physically possible. Then imagine that happening so suddenly your brain struggles to process what your eyes are seeing. That's the closest description I can give. 1 second he was standing there. The next second he was moving away from us at a speed that seemed impossible. His legs were moving. That's the strange part. He appeared to be running. But his body was traveling much faster than his movements should have allowed. Almost as though the world itself had skipped frames. As though reality had suddenly accelerated around him for a brief moment. My brain couldn't understand what it was seeing. The movement was so unnatural that it felt like watching a special effect in a movie. Except this wasn't a movie. This was real life. And all 5 of us were witnessing it at the same time. The man shot away from us at a speed that defied logic. To this day, I estimate it looked like at least 80 miles per hour. Maybe more. That number sounds ridiculous. I know it does. No human being can run that fast. Yet that's exactly why the memory has stayed with me. The speed didn't feel merely impressive. It felt impossible. The best comparison I can think of is that it looked like he was attached to something invisible that suddenly yanked him across the landscape. The motion was smooth, instantaneous, terrifying. One moment he was there. The next moment, he was gone. The entire event lasted only seconds. Yet those seconds completely changed the atmosphere around us. Every one of us froze. No one laughed. No one made a joke. No one tried to explain it. We simply stood there staring. The silence that followed was almost worse than the event itself. Because every one of us knew the others had seen it too. If I had been alone, I would have assumed I imagined it. I would have convinced myself that distance, lighting, or memory had distorted what happened. But there were 5 witnesses. 5 teenage boys. 5 people staring at the exact same thing. And every single one of us reacted the same way. Pure fear. I remember feeling a wave of panic wash over me. My stomach dropped. My heart started pounding. The world suddenly felt wrong. One of my friends became physically sick. Without warning, he bent over and vomited. The rest of us started crying. Looking back, that reaction sounds extreme. Teenage boys aren't exactly known for breaking down in tears, especially not in front of their friends. Yet that's what happened. The fear was overwhelming. It wasn't just fear of the man. It was fear of witnessing something that shouldn't have been possible. There's a difference. Most frightening situations involve danger, a fight, an accident, an aggressive animal, something you can understand. This was different. This felt like reality itself had malfunctioned. Every rule we thought we understood suddenly seemed uncertain. We stood there for what felt like forever. Nobody wanted to speak first. Nobody wanted to acknowledge what had happened, because acknowledging it would mean accepting that it was real. Eventually, we left. I don't remember who suggested it. I don't remember where we went afterward. I only remember wanting to get away from that place as quickly as possible. The rest of the day passed in a blur. We talked about it repeatedly. Each time, our descriptions remained the same. Nobody's story changed. Nobody admitted to imagining it. Nobody offered a convincing explanation. We all saw the same thing. Years have passed since that day. I've become an adult. I've experienced plenty of strange situations. I've learned how unreliable memory can be. I've learned how easily people can misinterpret events. Because of that, I've spent a lot of time trying to find a logical explanation. Maybe there was some visual illusion. Maybe distance distorted our perception. Maybe the desert heat affected visibility. Maybe several ordinary events combined in a way that created something extraordinary. I honestly don't know. What I do know is that the memory remains incredibly vivid. Even now, when I think about it, I can feel the same uneasiness returning. I can still picture the old man standing across the street. I can still remember his expression. I can still remember the moment our eyes met. And I can still see him suddenly moving away at a speed that seemed completely impossible. The thing that stays with me most isn't even the movement itself. It's the reaction afterward. The absolute certainty shared by everyone who was there. The silence. The fear. The feeling that we had witnessed something that didn't belong in the normal world. Maybe there is an explanation. Maybe there always was. But if there is, none of us have found it. To this day, whenever I think about the deserts around Kanab, I remember that afternoon. I remember the endless red rocks, the vast empty landscape, the strange feeling that the land was hiding things we weren't meant to understand. And I remember an old man laughing from across the street before vanishing from our lives in a way that still makes my hands shake whenever I think about it. More than 20 years later, I still don't know what we saw. I only know that 5 teenage boys saw it together. And none of us have ever forgotten it. There are some memories that never really leave you. No matter how much time passes, no matter how much your life changes, certain moments remain frozen in your mind. Sometimes they return unexpectedly. A smell, a sound, or a random thought can bring everything rushing back as if it happened yesterday. This is one of those memories for me. I was 13 years old when it happened. At the time, my brother and sister fought constantly. Their arguments were loud, dramatic, and seemed to happen over the smallest things. As the youngest sibling, I had become almost numb to it. Whenever they started yelling at each other, I usually ignored it. It was just part of life in our house. One night I was lying in bed trying to sleep when I heard them start arguing again. At first I paid very little attention. The shouting was coming from somewhere else in the house. I could hear raised voices, doors slamming, and the familiar sounds of another fight beginning. Nothing about it seemed unusual. In fact, it felt so normal that I barely reacted. I remember rolling over in bed and pulling my pillow over my ears. I was tired. I had school the next day. The last thing I wanted was to listen to another one of their arguments. For a while I tried to ignore the noise, but as the minutes passed, the sounds became louder. The shouting intensified. I could hear things crashing, objects breaking, furniture being knocked over. The entire house seemed to shake with the force of whatever was happening. Even then, I didn't think anything truly serious was taking place. I assumed it was another explosive argument that would eventually burn itself out. Teenagers don't always recognize danger when it's happening around them, especially when they're used to chaos. So I stayed in bed. I covered my ears tighter, and I waited for it to stop. Eventually, it did. The screaming ended. The crashing stopped. The house became quiet. At first, the silence felt like a relief. Then it started feeling strange. The sudden absence of noise was almost more unsettling than the argument itself. I lay there for a few moments, wondering what had happened. Had they finally calmed down? Had one of them stormed out? Had my parents stepped in? I didn't know. Curiosity eventually got the better of me. I climbed out of bed and walked toward my bedroom door. Everything felt normal right up until the moment I opened it. The second the door swung open, my entire world changed. For a moment, my brain couldn't understand what I was seeing. The hallway was covered in blood. Not a small amount, not a few drops. Blood was everywhere. The floor looked soaked. Dark stains stretched down the hallway. There were bloody handprints smeared across the walls. The sight was so shocking that I froze instantly. Even now, years later, I can still remember that moment. The image is burned into my memory. At 13 years old, I had never seen anything remotely like it. My mind struggled to process what I was looking at. For several seconds, I honestly thought I must be dreaming. Nothing felt real. The hallway that I walked through every day suddenly looked like the scene of a horror movie. I remember standing there, staring, trying to make sense of it, trying to understand how a normal family argument could possibly have turned into this. Then, survival instinct took over. I started moving, slowly at first, then faster. I followed the trail down the hallway. The blood seemed endless. Every step made my heart beat harder. The further I went, the more terrified I became. I kept expecting someone to jump out and tell me it was a joke, some kind of prank, some misunderstanding. But deep down, I already knew it wasn't. When I reached the end of the hallway, I saw a knife lying on the floor. A steak knife. Even as a kid, I immediately understood that this was very bad. The sight of the knife made everything suddenly feel real. The argument, the crashing noises, the blood, all of it. Then I looked toward the couch, and I saw my brother. He was covered in blood. At first, I thought he was dead. The amount of blood was overwhelming. I had never seen a person injured like that before. My brother looked pale, weak, barely conscious. The scene was so horrific that my memory becomes fragmented around that point. There are pieces I remember clearly, and pieces that feel missing. Almost as though my brain intentionally erased parts of the experience. What I later learned was even more shocking. During the fight, my sister had stabbed my brother in the stomach. The knife had severed his femoral artery. The injury was catastrophic. He was bleeding heavily and losing blood incredibly fast. Under normal circumstances, injuries like that can be fatal within minutes. The situation had become a life-or-death emergency almost instantly. The strange thing is that my family later told me I played a role in helping save him. Apparently, while everyone was panicking, I grabbed a towel and pressed it against the wound to help slow the bleeding. According to them, I stayed there applying pressure until emergency responders arrived. The problem is that I don't remember doing that at all. It's one of the strangest aspects of the entire experience. There is a complete gap in my memory. I remember finding the blood. I remember seeing the knife. I remember seeing my brother on the couch. Then there are fragments, flashes, pieces of memory. After that, the next thing I clearly remember is being surrounded by adults and emergency personnel. Everything in between feels blurred, almost as though my brain shut down and switched into autopilot. I've since learned that memory loss during traumatic events isn't uncommon. People often remember the beginning and end of a crisis while forgetting large portions of what happened in the middle. At the time, however, it felt incredibly strange to have people tell me what I did while having absolutely no recollection of doing it. The following weeks were some of the most difficult of my life. My brother spent time recovering. The entire family was thrown into chaos. Police became involved. Doctors became involved. Every aspect of our normal lives was disrupted. Nothing felt stable anymore. For a while, school became the least important thing in the world. I missed classes. I stayed home. I struggled to process what had happened. Looking back, I don't think I truly understood the severity of the situation at the time. I knew it was bad. I knew my brother had nearly died. But I don't think my 13-year-old brain fully grasped how close we had come to losing him. The realization came later. Much later, when I finally returned to school, people naturally wanted to know where I had been. I wasn't someone who enjoyed attention. I wasn't looking for sympathy. I simply explained what had happened. Or at least, I tried to. The reactions weren't what I expected. Instead of concern, many of my friends laughed. They thought I was making it up. Some assumed I was exaggerating. Others thought I was telling an outrageous story for attention. The more details I shared, the less believable it sounded to them. In their defense, it probably did sound unbelievable. A 13-year-old explaining that his sister stabbed his brother during an argument sounds like something from a television drama rather than real life. But for me, it wasn't a story. It wasn't gossip. It wasn't entertainment. It was one of the most traumatic nights of my childhood. I remember feeling frustrated, angry, confused. Part of me wanted to prove it had happened. Another part of me was exhausted by the idea of having to defend something so painful. Eventually, I stopped trying. People believe what they want to believe. Some accepted the story. Others didn't. Life moved on, but the memory never disappeared. Even now, years later, there are moments when I think about that night. I think about lying in bed, assuming it was just another argument. I think about pulling the pillow over my ears and trying to ignore the noise. I think about opening that bedroom door. And I think about the hallway. The blood. The handprints. The overwhelming realization that something terrible had happened while I sat in my room assuming everything was normal. The strangest part is how ordinary the evening seemed before everything changed. One moment, it was just another night. The next moment, my family was in the middle of a life-threatening crisis. That's something people rarely talk about when discussing trauma. It doesn't always arrive with warning signs. Sometimes it appears suddenly and without explanation. A normal day becomes a nightmare in a matter of seconds. My brother survived. To this day, I still don't know how. The doctors, the emergency responders, and everyone involved deserve credit for that. By all accounts, the injury was incredibly serious. Yet somehow, against the odds, he pulled through. For that, I will always be grateful. Because as horrifying as that night was, the alternative would have been far worse. And while many people didn't believe my story when I first told it, I wish more than anything that it had actually been made up. Unfortunately, it wasn't. It happened. And it's a night I will never forget for as long as I live. One of the strangest experiences of my childhood happened in a house in New Jersey. And even after all these years, I still can't explain it. I've replayed the memory in my head countless times, trying to come up with a logical answer. But every explanation seems to fall apart when I remember one important detail. Whatever I saw was outside a second-floor window on a part of the house that was effectively 3 stories above the ground. I was fairly young at the time, old enough to remember the event clearly, but young enough that being sent to my room still felt like the end of the world. My brother and I shared a bedroom on the second floor of our house. It wasn't a huge room, but it had enough space for both of our beds and a few pieces of furniture. One of the most noticeable features was the window positioned directly above my brother's bed. The layout of the property made that window particularly unusual. From the front of the house, it looked like a normal second-floor window. But because the house sat on a slope and had a basement underneath one side, the distance from that window to the ground on the outside was much greater than it appeared. On that side of the house, the basement effectively created a third level. Anyone standing outside would have been looking up at what was essentially a third-story window. Even more importantly, the exterior wall wasn't something that could easily be climbed. The siding and structure angled downward in a way that made scaling it nearly impossible. There were no nearby trees, no balconies, no ladders, and no convenient places to stand. At least, not that I ever saw. The day of the incident had been completely ordinary. Like most kids, I had managed to get myself into trouble over something I probably thought wasn't a big deal at the time. I don't even remember what I did anymore. Whatever it was, my punishment involved spending some time alone in my room. I remember sitting there feeling annoyed and bored. The room was quiet. My brother wasn't there. The rest of the house seemed calm. With nothing else to do, I found myself staring out the window above my brother's bed. I wasn't looking for anything in particular. I was simply watching the outside world and letting my mind wander. The afternoon light was fading, and the room had that dim atmosphere that comes just before evening settles in completely. Everything seemed normal. Then, without any warning whatsoever, something slammed against the outside of the glass. The sound was loud enough to make me jump immediately. I snapped my attention toward the window, and that's when I saw it. Pressed against the outside of the glass was a hand. At least, it looked like a hand. The thing that immediately stood out was how unnatural it appeared. The fingers were long, much longer than what I would expect from an ordinary human hand. The nails looked unusually long as well. Not slightly long, noticeably long. The entire shape seemed wrong somehow. Even now, decades later, that's the best way I can describe it. Wrong, the hand wasn't simply resting against the window. It had struck it. The image burned itself into my memory almost instantly. I remember a wave of fear hitting me so hard that I could barely think. My body reacted before my brain did. I dove under my blanket. For a few seconds, I hid completely. Like many frightened children, I convinced myself that if I couldn't see whatever was outside, maybe it couldn't see me. Of course, curiosity eventually got the better of me. I slowly lowered the blanket and peeked out. The hand was still there, pressed against the glass. Motionless, waiting, I remember staring at it in disbelief. Part of me wanted to scream. Part of me couldn't stop looking. The fear was overwhelming, but so was the confusion. How could anything be outside that window? That question kept repeating itself in my head. The height alone should have made it impossible. There was simply nowhere for a person to stand. No ledge, no platform, no obvious explanation. Yet there it was, a hand against the glass. For what felt like forever, I remained frozen. I don't know how long the hand stayed there. In reality, it was probably only a short period of time. Fear has a way of stretching seconds into minutes. As I watched, I became aware of another sound. The bedroom door was opening. My brother was coming into the room. The moment the door moved, something happened. The hand began to slide away. Not quickly. Not dramatically. It simply moved downward and disappeared below the bottom edge of the window. The motion itself was unsettling. It looked deliberate, almost as if whatever had been there knew someone else was entering the room. Within seconds, it was gone. I stared at the now empty window in shock. My brother stepped inside. He immediately noticed that something was wrong. Apparently, the look on my face gave it away. I asked him if he had seen anything. At first, he seemed confused. Then he told me he thought he had seen a shadow outside the window as he approached the room. That response sent another chill through me. He hadn't seen the hand itself. At least, not that he remembered. But he had noticed something. Enough to describe it as a shadow. That was all the confirmation I needed at the time. The experience became one of those childhood memories that never fully faded away. For years afterward, I found myself staring at that same window whenever I entered the room. Part of me expected the hand to return. Part of me feared it would. Every creak outside made me nervous. Every movement beyond the glass caught my attention. Nothing like that ever happened again. The hand never returned. There were no more strange shadows, no additional sightings, just that single encounter. Yet somehow, that one moment was enough to leave a permanent impression. As I got older, I began trying to explain what happened. I considered every possibility I could think of. Maybe it was a trick of the light. Maybe it was a branch or some object creating an illusion. Maybe my childhood imagination exaggerated a perfectly ordinary event. Those explanations would make sense if not for one problem. The height. Every explanation eventually runs into the same obstacle. Whatever I saw appeared to be directly outside a window that should have been inaccessible. Even if someone had somehow climbed up there, maintaining a position against the glass would have been incredibly difficult. The structure of the house simply didn't allow for it. I've even revisited the memory with adult eyes and tried to imagine what a prankster or trespasser would have needed to do. Nothing fits comfortably. The logistics never seem to work. That doesn't mean there isn't an explanation. There probably is. Most mysteries eventually turn out to have surprisingly ordinary answers. I fully accept that possibility. But accepting that possibility hasn't erased the memory. I can still picture the scene perfectly. The dim room. The boredom of being sent to my room. The sudden impact against the window. The sight of those long fingers pressed against the glass. The fear that sent me diving beneath my blanket. And the way the hand slowly slid out of sight when my brother entered the room. The strangest part isn't even the hand itself. It's the fact that my brother noticed something too. Not enough to fully confirm what I saw, but enough to make me question whether it was entirely in my imagination. If I had been alone, I probably would have convinced myself that I misinterpreted something. Children see strange things all the time. Memory is imperfect. Fear distorts perception. But my brother's comment about the shadow has always lingered in the back of my mind. Maybe he really did see something. Maybe we both witnessed different pieces of the same event. Or maybe it was all a coincidence. I honestly don't know. What I do know is that, out of all the strange memories from my childhood, this one remains among the clearest. Years have passed. I've lived in different houses. I've experienced far more significant events. Yet every now and then, I'll think about that old bedroom in New Jersey and find myself wondering the same thing I wondered as a child. What was outside that window? And how did it get there? I've had a lot of people tell me that what happened was probably a coincidence. Maybe it was faulty wiring. Maybe someone accidentally left the switch on. Maybe grief made me notice things I otherwise would have ignored. I understand those explanations, and honestly, part of me has considered all of them over the years. But no matter how much I try to rationalize it, the timing has always felt too strange to ignore. It happened immediately after my father passed away. Losing him was one of the hardest experiences of my life. The days that followed felt unreal, as though the world had somehow shifted and become unfamiliar overnight. Everything moved in slow motion. Family members came and went. Phone calls had to be made. arrangements had to be handled. Everyone was grieving in their own way. The house felt different after he was gone. Quieter, emptier, like something important had been removed from it. During that first week after his death, I wasn't sleeping well. I'd wake up several times throughout the night and usually stay awake longer than I wanted. My mind kept replaying memories, conversations, and all the things I wished I could say one more time. One morning, a few days after he passed, I woke up and noticed something odd. The light under the basement stairs was on. At first, I didn't think much about it. The space under the stairs was used mostly for storage. Old boxes, seasonal decorations, and random household items were kept there. It wasn't a room people regularly visited. In fact, I hadn't been inside that storage area in months. I noticed the light and assumed someone else in the house must have gone down there for some reason. Life was chaotic at the time. There were family members visiting. People were moving through the house. It seemed completely possible that somebody had simply forgotten to switch it off. So I ignored it. The next morning, I woke up and noticed the light again. That caught my attention. I remember standing at the top of the basement stairs, staring down at the glowing doorway. It felt strange. Still, I found a reasonable explanation. Someone must have forgotten again. Maybe it had never been turned off in the first place. Maybe I just hadn't noticed it until now. Those explanations made sense. The problem was that it kept happening. Day after day. Every morning. The light was on. No matter how many times it was switched off, somehow it would be on again when I woke up. The repetition was what made it unsettling. If it had happened once, I would have forgotten about it. Twice, maybe, but every day for nearly a week? That was harder to dismiss. The longer it continued, the more I found myself thinking about my father. The storage area wasn't some random location in the house. It was one of those spaces connected to years of family memories, the kind of place where old belongings accumulated over time, the kind of place where parents stored things they insisted they would need someday. Every time I saw the light, I found myself thinking about him. At first, I resisted the idea that the two things were connected. I've always tried to approach unusual events with a healthy amount of skepticism. But grief does strange things to people. You start looking for signs. You start noticing patterns. You start wondering whether the people you've lost are somehow still nearby. By the 6th or 7th day, I found myself talking to the empty house. Not because I expected an answer. Not because I was trying to summon anything. I was simply exhausted. Emotionally exhausted. Mentally exhausted. Tired of wondering. That morning, I stood near the basement stairs and spoke out loud. I remember saying something along the lines of, "Okay, I get it. I know you're here. Thank you for the message." It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't emotional. It was almost conversational. The kind of thing you say when you've spent a week wrestling with the same thought. Then I went about my day. The following morning, I woke up and immediately looked toward the basement. The light was off. The next day, it remained off. The day after that, it was still off. And from that point forward, it never happened again. Not once. That was the part that stayed with me. Not the light itself. Not even the timing. It was the way the pattern stopped immediately after I acknowledged it. Maybe that was coincidence. Maybe the issue corrected itself naturally. Maybe someone finally remembered to turn it off. Those explanations are entirely possible. But I'll admit that the timing still makes me pause whenever I think about it. What made the experience even stranger was that it wasn't the only story like that in my family. A few years later, I was staying at my aunt's house shortly after her mother had passed away. She was going through her own grieving process, dealing with many of the same emotions I had experienced after losing my father. During that time, something unusual started happening in her house as well. Without getting into every detail, there were repeated events that seemed connected to her mother. Small things, easy to dismiss individually, yet difficult to ignore because of how consistently they occurred. I remember watching my aunt react to them. The look on her face reminded me of my own experience, not fear, not panic, recognition, as though she felt someone familiar was trying to remind her they hadn't completely disappeared. Again, maybe there were ordinary explanations. Maybe grief simply makes us more attentive to things we would normally overlook. That's certainly possible. But seeing a similar experience happen to someone else made my own memories harder to dismiss. Over the years, I've heard countless stories from people who experienced strange occurrences shortly after losing someone they loved. Lights turning on, radios playing favorite songs unexpectedly, clocks stopping, objects appearing in unusual places, dreams that felt impossibly real. Whether those experiences are supernatural or psychological, I honestly don't know. I'm not claiming to have proof of ghosts. I can't provide evidence. I can't explain what happened scientifically. All I can do is describe what I experienced. For 1 week after my father's death, a light in a storage area that nobody used kept turning itself on every single morning. After I finally acknowledged it and spoke out loud, it stopped immediately. And it never happened again. Maybe there was a logical explanation hiding somewhere in the background. Maybe there always is. But when I think back to that difficult week, I don't remember feeling frightened. I remember feeling comforted. Because during one of the hardest periods of my life, it felt as though someone was trying to remind me that I wasn't completely alone. Whether that feeling came from my father, from coincidence, or from my own grieving mind, doesn't really change the impact it had on me. What matters is that for a brief moment, in the middle of loss and heartbreak, I felt connected to him again. And sometimes, that's enough. To this day, whenever someone tells me a story about signs from loved ones who have passed away, I don't immediately dismiss it. Maybe there are explanations we haven't considered. Maybe grief works in mysterious ways. Or maybe, just maybe, the people we love find small ways to let us know they're still with us. I can't prove any of it, but after what happened that week, I'm much more open to the possibility than I used to be.